Welcome to the sixth episode of Reach Minds, Thoughts for Your Life's Journey podcast. In today's episode, we will do a deep dive into the transformative power of self-compassion and self-kindness. We'll be exploring what it means to be truly kind to ourselves. Why is that important? And how can we positively impact every areas of our lives? Today in particular, I'm very excited and delighted to introduce a colleague, which I'm sure many people are very familiar with, Shamash Alidina, who's going to be joining me in our conversation around self-compassion and self-kindness. Now, many of you may know he's the best-known international author of 10 books, including Mindfulness for Dummies and Mindful Ways Through Stress. He frequently appears in newspapers, magazines, and so forth. He's based in London and runs online training and speaks at many conferences all over the world. He has been a keen educator and has trained over 500 mindfulness teachers in the last 11 years. Prior to that, he spent 10 years teaching mindfulness, meditation, as well as science in schools. Back in 2013, he pioneered online mindfulness teacher training, launching his program. With 10 years of experience in running online courses, he creates new courses. Now, the question I'm going to ask Shamash is, have you ever caught yourself being your own harshest critic?
Absolutely. First of all, thank you so much, Nita, for having me on your podcast. So excited to be here and to talk about such an important topic, I think, self-compassion. Yes, I have been my own harshest self-critic. They say sometimes you teach what you need to learn most, and I teach a lot about mindfulness and teach a lot about self-compassion and self-kindness. Is most likely because it's something that I need to practice a lot myself. Interestingly, with self-compassion, I didn't really appreciate the importance of it even after I started learning mindfulness, because mindfulness was about being in the present moment. That was what was most emphasized to me. And I was practicing it in that way and trying to concentrate and trying to focus. And it was only once I started learning more about not just mindfulness, but kindfulness and about the science of self-compassion that I discovered the importance of actually trying to be too perfectionist, trying to do everything really well, trying to be number one at everything. It seems to be quite a noble thing to do, but it can actually cause you to burn out and get really tired. And so you need to balance that with self-compassion. So yeah, we'll talk more about what self-compassion means. But yeah, I found that when I did learn about that and learned to take a kinder approach to myself, not just in my work, but even in the way I practiced meditation, it felt sometimes like I was being lazy or I wasn't doing the right thing. But actually, I was leaning into what felt uncomfortable, which is about being a bit more imperfect, about being with things as they are, about not always constantly focusing on goals, but letting them go as well. And that's when I found myself recharging and rejuvenating. And then when I looked at the research, I discovered this is the way to be. Not only does it feel better, but it actually ends up creating a lot more positive outcomes for ourselves. And also, by being kinder to ourselves, we also end up being kinder to others as well. So it has this amazing ripple effect as well.
Absolutely. So where I'm curious is, Shamash, is what was the trigger point for you?
The trigger point was, I can't remember what year it was, but I was giving, mindfulness was particularly popular and I was traveling across different time zones. So I was traveling to Thailand and China and Australia and New Zealand and going around giving all these talks on mindfulness. And then when I came back, it was taking me much longer than usual to get over the jet lag. A few days went past, a week went past, even 2 weeks went past, and still there was that sense of fatigue, even in the morning. And I was doing my meditation and it wasn't going away. So I wasn't sure what to do. I thought getting burnout as a mindfulness teacher is just not a good look. So I thought I need to do something. So I thought, okay, let me just try sleeping when I felt tired, even if it was during the day. So I tried doing that and I wasn't falling asleep. So then I started just looking on YouTube for things to listen to and ended up finding a whole retreat on YouTube. So I thought, oh, wow, I can actually do a retreat from my bed. Maybe I could just listen to the retreat meditations and that could help. And that's when this teacher of meditation, his name is Ajahn Brahm, he emphasized not just mindfulness, but kindfulness and the self-compassion. And he even recommended not even trying to focus your mind in the present moment, like just let it wander off and just observe it and just watch it. And he even said you don't have to do meditation, you can do meditation. So you could be in bed and practicing meditation from bed. So this very self-compassionate approach, which I thought wouldn't work. I thought it would just make my mind wander even more and make things worse. But actually, within a few days, I started to get some of the best meditations I've ever experienced. And I think what was happening is that the body and mind was starting to get fully recharged. Whereas before, because there was always this foot on the accelerator or the brake, that sense of control, there wasn't enough time for my body and mind to recharge. So then I got so excited about this new way of practicing meditation. I created a whole course about it. Kindfulness, I called it, based on what I learned from Ajahn Brahm. And I went on some retreats with him, actually. Yeah.
Sounds a bit
That's how I
awesome.
learned about it and shared it. Yeah, it was brilliant.
How do you think self-compassion may differ from what some people might think, or isn't it a bit self-indulgent?
Yeah, I know. That's a great question. And that's one of the reasons that people don't want to practice. Self-compassion, if you look at the word compassion, it's made out of two elements, C-O-M, and then passion. And the word passion, the root meaning of the word passion is to suffer. So compassion means to suffer with. So when you have compassion for someone, someone's going through a hard time, they're suffering, and you're connecting with them and with their suffering. So that's compassion. So to practice self-compassion is to notice when you yourself are actually going through some suffering and to connect with yourself in a kind way. Now, self-indulgence, that it's leading more towards an avoidance rather than compassion, which is to suffer with, self-compassion. With self-indulgence, it's absolutely okay to indulge from time to time. You may give yourself a treat or do something to take your mind off all your worries and concerns. That's okay from time to time. But if that's your only way of dealing with difficulties, it becomes an act of avoidance. Whereas mindfulness and self-compassion is the opposite. It's about moving towards it, dealing with it, transforming it, and working with it in a different way. So, although they seem really similar, like self-compassion and self-indulgence, they're fundamentally quite different, actually, and take a totally different approach. So, it's a really important thing to distinguish between self-indulgence and self-compassion when you meet that suffering within yourself.
I like what you're saying in terms of that self-compassion is if you're, it's the self bit and the compassion, you're taking care of yourself, what your
Mm.
needs are. And maybe self-indulgent might be, oh, going to have a facial or something like that. And that isn't the same as self-compassion because maybe, I don't know, you're looking more on the outer rather than the inner. What do you say
Mm.
about that?
Yeah, it depends more about the intention. Like, let's say you've been working really hard and it's really nice for you to have a facial. It's really recharging for you and it's something that would be helpful for you. It could be considered as an act of self-compassion, or maybe self-care would be a better word for it. You're practicing
Yeah.
some self-care, which is really important. So nothing wrong with that at all. In fact, I'd encourage it. It becomes like a self-indulgence if, let's say, you're going for a facial every day when actually you've got some stuff that's causing a lot of problems and difficulties, and rather than dealing with it, you just constantly avoid it through indulging, whether it's to do with, and it could be so many different things. It could be computer games, it could be internet, it could be social media, it could be spending time with people, but in a way to avoid what needs to be dealt with, or your inner suffering that you need to open up to. So it's more to do with not so much the action, but what's the intention behind it? And is the intention total avoidance, or is the intention actually making space for it? And they're fundamentally different. And one is much more healing than the other.
So how can someone, if they're not looking at their suffering, how can they get there. It seems to me if their strategy in life is one of avoidance, how can they get connected to that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's an important, fundamental question. I think it happens naturally to people because we try the easy strategy to solve problems automatically. So let's say it's to do with anxiety and you've been avoiding the anxiety through all sorts of different things and it keeps coming back. You may find that it's just getting worse and worse. And eventually you think, you know what? I've been trying all these strategies and I've tried all these different therapies and techniques and avoidance strategies, and none of them have worked. So maybe I need to try a different approach. And you probably may need someone to work through with you one to one to talk you through it. You may be able to do it just through a book or listening to a podcast like this. But there may be a point where you're like, you know what? I want to try something different, something fundamentally different. And so when you reach that point, you think, okay, so this mindfulness stuff or this self-compassion stuff is about making space, opening up. So maybe just for 1 second, let me see if for 1 second I can feel this feeling that I'm always avoiding. Or just for a few moments, I could just breathe with it. Or maybe I could do a 1 minute meditation where I put my hand on my heart and I just allow myself to feel that suffering that I've been running away from. So it's important. Another kind of philosophy that I've love as well is called Kaizen, and it's this Japanese philosophy of tiny steps. So that's why I say it might be 1 second, it might be 5 seconds, whatever it is for you. But for that tiny length of time, you open up to it and see what happens. And then if you feel that you're able to manage that, you step by step keep growing it. Or there may be many other techniques that you may do. For example, you may use a creative approach like painting your feelings, or doing some journaling, or talking to someone, or spending time in nature as you process the feelings. There's many different ways. So it depends on your interests and your passions, and you can connect that to help you through your, I guess it's like a self-healing process.
I like that and there's
Mm.
multitude ways that we can access it if we hold still
Exactly.
enough and ask ourselves, what do I need right now?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And that's another technique which you've shared there, which is just to stop and to question, just ask yourself, what do I need right now? How can I best take care of myself right now? How can I be self-compassionate to myself right now? How would I treat a best friend going through this challenge? And then treating yourself in that way. These are good questions to help you to step towards self-compassion.
Some people might be skeptical about this stuff and sort of, is there a bit, what's the
Yeah.
research around self-compassion and
Well, you
self-kindness? And I know
and
we haven't done the difference between self-kindness and self-compassion. So maybe we can address that first and say, and what's the
yeah.
research behind both of those?
Yeah, so self-kindness and self-compassion, they sound quite similar. Self-kindness is a little bit more narrow. It's an aspect of the practice of self-compassion. And I can connect this with the research. So it was Christine Neff who first realized, Dr. Christine Neff, I think out of Texas, she started to realize actually there's this whole concept and approach called self-compassion, which hasn't been fully researched. So she looked at all the different ancient traditions, looked at all the scripts and the stuff, and reflected and looked at the research. And she concluded that there was three components when it comes to practicing self-compassion. The first one, and it's to do with a moment of suffering. So the first one is the mindfulness part, and mindfulness is, or you could just call it present moment awareness. So it's just to, and also you could call it a form of acceptance as well. But it's that step of recognizing this is a moment of difficulty, this is a moment of suffering, this is a moment of challenge for me. Okay, so remember the self compassion is to do with that. Okay, this is a moment of difficulty for me. So to notice that, you might notice it physically in your body. You may notice the harsh, critical thoughts. You may feel the sense of tiredness, but something's woken you up to the fact that there's some suffering happening here. So that's the mindfulness. Then the next step you could say is the self kindness. So this is more to do with the language you may use. So the opposite of being a self kind would be a self critic. So you'd be saying, that wasn't good enough. You're not trying hard enough. You messed up. Why are you so stupid? Calling yourself names. So it would be noticing that, creating some space between you and that, And you may have some words or some phrase or maybe some image that represents a much more friendly approach to yourself. Okay. So that's the self kindness. It's the words you may use in your mind, the images, potentially some action you may do, which is self kind. And then the third dimension, an interesting dimension she discovered about self compassion, is called common humanity. And that means it's just reminding you that just like you're going through suffering right now, all human beings, every single human being goes through some suffering. And what happens is that when we're self critical, there's a sense of isolation that happens. We separate, we're like, oh, I'm messing up, but nobody else is, or I'm suffering, but nobody else is, which is completely the opposite. Everyone goes through suffering. So, this common humanity dimension is that just like me, everyone suffers at some point. So this suffering isn't isolating, it's actually connecting. It means, hey, I'm a human being. I'm suffering like everyone else. So these are the different dimensions she discovered. And she created a scale and worked with other colleagues. And they did all sorts of different interesting research, finding that through practicing self compassion, rather than your motivation going down, your motivation goes up. Rather than your resilience going down, your resilience goes up. Rather than causing problems in your relationships, it improves your relationships. So there's been loads of research having positive findings on self-compassion. So really important skill to learn.
One of the things I read somewhere years ago that people who are high achievers can use self-criticism as a way of forging forward. It's their strategies. How do you get someone to reframe that for themselves and say, I can still go ahead, I can still have the edge by being self compassionate? How do you get somebody to switch from that?
Yeah, I think what you would find is that if a person's being self-critical, then they might find themselves starting to get into lower moods more, feeling anxious more, getting a bit more worn out. So if the strategy was 100% working for them, they would not even be open to listening or learning or trying something new. But most likely there will something will be going wrong and there'll be some challenge that they're going through, like, okay, this isn't working. What's the solution? And the example I like to give is that imagine you're a parent and a child comes along and they've done really badly in their maths test at school. And the first child, you said the parent is really harsh. It's very critical. It's like, you messed up. You only got 55%. You should be getting a grade A star and you've got a C or something. You're not working hard enough. You go to your bedroom, study really hard and you're really harsh to this child. Okay, what do you think's happening to their motivation? Are they going to be loving maths and can't wait to do more maths, or is their motivation going to be quite low? Most people can intuitively think, actually, they're probably not going to like maths. They'll do it because they're being forced to do it, but they're not exactly likely to be excited. And then the second child comes home, different parent, and they're encouraging them. They're like, hey, okay, you got 55, so you got something, but there's definitely some room for improvement too. Let's first of all focus. Well done, you got these questions right. Some difficult questions you got right. That's fantastic. Let's do some work together. Maybe after you've had a little bit of a break, and I'll show you some techniques that will really help you in your maths. Encouraging approach boosts motivation. And so just think, basically, you've got that inner child like that in yourself. So if you're criticizing yourself, your motivation's being pushed down. Whereas if you're encouraging yourself, then you're like, okay, yeah, I messed up this time, but next time I'll try a little bit harder. You're encouraging yourself, you're being self-compassionate rather than self-critical, and you're more likely to be motivated and successful. So that's the example that kind of something clicked within me, and that made me think, actually, yeah, this self-compassion could actually be really powerful. It's like having an inner coach rather than an inner critic.
It's a really important thing to think about, the messages that we get given when we're younger in terms of our learning strategies and how do we learn best. So over the years, you've been doing this now for a while. What are some of the benefits have you noticed in terms of individuals and organization that you've come across?
First of all, I think people share mostly on the individual level how the a self-critic and you're constantly harsh with yourself, it's just very tiring. It wears you out. It makes you feel anxious. It lowers your mood. It lowers your confidence as well. You think you're not good enough, so you don't take on challenges so much because of you know how you'll be harsh on yourself. It just makes everything that you do a struggle. The people that you connect with, the work that you do, home life, and then that has a ripple effect in organization. So when a person goes to work, they might not take on their new challenges because if they know that, oh, I won't be able to do it. And also procrastination, I think, is quite a big one too. When people are more self-critical, they would procrastinate more as there's more fear around the next activity they need to do. And so they may not be willing to take that next step. And then a massive effect on resilience. Someone criticizes you, for example, at work or at home. If you've got that self-critic within you, that would reinforce it, make it even stronger. Whereas if you've got that part of you that, okay, yeah, that person's criticized, but maybe they're having a bad day, or that doesn't mean that it's true. They might be, so they might be more resilient and able to bounce back and take more chances. Like you are with this podcast, you're doing something new, you're doing a new project, you're putting yourself out there. That takes courage. And if the self-critic, if you just listen to that, then it wouldn't happen. If you've got that self-compassionate part of your mind, okay, may not be perfect, but I'm having a go. I'll do it. I'll put it out there, and we'll see how it helps other people. So that's a great example of that. So it has, not only does it feel better once you start to get the hang of it. At the beginning, it's difficult, but you're starting to reprogram yourself, and then the urge is to share it with others as well, like I'm doing, like you're doing as well. So once you start to find the benefits of it, you want to share it with others. So yeah, it has a direct impact on our level of well-being personally, on our connection with our relationships, and also greater success in the workplace too.
A colleague of mine said, "You're very brave doing this." And I said, "I can't ask my clients to do something if I'm not willing to do it myself." And
Yeah.
so I agree with you. I think we need to stretch ourselves and look at things appropriately and move out of our sort of comfort zone, really. So, what might be some of the challenges do you think a person may face in practicing self-compassion as a consistent practice?
As a consistent practice. First of all, just doing the practice itself would be difficult because if you think about it, often if you ask a person how long has this self-critic been within you, and it would be at least in 20, 30, 40, 50 years, right from when they were quite young. They had this programming through their parents or their teachers, or just it arose within themselves to be critical of yourself. So if you've had years and years, decades of programming, then in a half an hour podcast, it's not going to instantly change, or even one session with someone. It may do, but imagine the years of programming before that. So it does take a little bit of time. It's much shorter. It doesn't take decades and decades, fortunately. It may just take a period of weeks or months where things start to change. They can measure effects that happened in a couple of months, which if you think about it, it's amazing when you've been practicing self-criticism only for decades. So there's some patience required. Secondly, something that happens, they sometimes call it like a backdraft. It's like a pushback, which is when you try becoming more mindful and practicing self-kindness, the self-critic seems to have a stronger voice and it comes back to you stronger. And so some people think, oh, this isn't working for me because it's getting worse. But actually, you're finally opening the door to your heart, essentially, and learning to be kind to yourself. And all that self-criticism that's been locked away for years is starting to release itself. And so that's why you need to go gently, maybe do a course, find a teacher or a coach or someone who's self-compassionate, who you get on well with, to help you, support you through that. And yeah, so there's patience required. And then, like you said, consistency, so regular practice. Linked to my Kaizen approach, the small steps, there is a practice that you can do which just takes 2 or 3 minutes. So if you are not willing to, or have the time or the motivation to do 20-minute practices of self-compassion meditations and things, you can start with just 2-3 minutes and do this, what's called the self-compassion break, where it got these 3 stages: the mindfulness, the self-kindness, the common humanity. And just doing that once, twice, 3 times a day over a period of weeks, you'll start to notice a shift. And I think it's better to do a small practice regularly than like a really big practice and then you forget about it. And so linking it as part of your routine would make a huge difference, putting self-compassion into your routine. So yeah, there's some ideas that come to mind.
Those are wonderful tips for us to become more kinder to ourselves. Consistency, small steps, even if it's 2 or 3 minutes a day. And I love the idea around the meditation, the self-kindness, and the common humanity. Now, is there anything else that you think in terms of wisdom that you can leave people with? You already done a lot in terms of strategies of how to start. Is there anything else that you think this would be really great for people to start their journey?
One, going back to the kind of small steps, this is a literal small step, which I think is a brilliant one, which is when you wake up in the morning and your feet touch the floor. That's something that you do pretty much every day, hopefully. And so when that happens, you can connect that with an action. So if you like what you heard today and you say, okay, yeah, I want to practice more of this self-compassion, tomorrow morning, when you wake up in the morning and your feet touch the floor, use that as a moment to say to yourself, how can I be self-compassionate today? Or how can I practice self-kindness today? Or how can I practice some self-compassion today? Or maybe even if you discover this self-compassion break, this 3-minute meditation, maybe when your feet touch the floor, you close your eyes and you go through the 3-step process, the mindfulness, the self-kindness, the common humanity. So that's a nice moment in the day to practice it. And then maybe you can practice a little bit or bring it to mind in your breaks during the day, like when you're having your tea or coffee or between activities. Just could be just 3 breaths. Your first breath, mindfulness, the second breath, common humanity, any difficulties I'm going through. So are many other people around the world. Self-kindness. May I be kind to myself. May I say kind words to myself rather than just the self-critical ones. So yeah, there are a few ideas. Another thing we haven't talked about is you could actually do a little bit of journaling to do with self-compassion. You can actually write a letter to yourself as if you're your best self-compassionate friend rather than your critic. So you could literally write a letter, dear, and then your name, and then write whatever you want to write self-compassionately, and then sign your name again. And then you can read that to yourself, or you can literally post it to yourself if you want, or ask a friend to post it to you at some point in the future.
Shamash, thank you very much for being part of this podcast. And as you were talking through the 3 steps, I was feeling it in my own body. It's calmed me even further than I started off as. So thank you very much for taking part in this podcast.
Thank you, Nita. Absolute pleasure. Thank you for doing this, and glad I could help.